Amen. This past week, I tried something that I haven't had in a while, which is a Brazilian cheese bread, pão de queijo. Have you guys ever had that? So good. Am I butchering that, bro? Pão de queijo? Not bad? 100%, is that right? Or close? I appreciate it, man. Thank you. My Indian heart rejoices at that grade. Pão de queijo. Something I had, it is delicious. If you haven't had it, you should try it. It's really, really good. And I thought about the fact that, man, this is, the texture's incredible. It's crispy on the outside, gooey on the inside, chewy on the inside. How is this possible? Both textures, all wrapped up in this delicious cheese bread. And I thought about the fact that for me, this brings me so much delight, and that there are yet, for so many others, for those that are gluten intolerant and lactose intolerant, this would not be as enjoyable as it is for me, as it was for me. I hope for many of us it is enjoyable, by the way. But it's amazing, right? It's the same thing, but there are different reactions to the very same thing. For some it's joy, for some it's aversion, for some it's an allergic reaction, but it's still the same thing. And today we're going to be in Matthew chapter 2, where we look at different reactions to the same Jesus. Jesus doesn't change. King Jesus is a baby, and yet there are different reactions to this very same Jesus. So let's read out of Matthew chapter 2, and we're going to read through this, and I'm going to highlight a couple of different reactions to Jesus in this passage. It reads like this: After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews?" For context, can you imagine walking into the Saudi royal court and talking to the king of Saudi Arabia, you have an audience with the king of Saudi Arabia, and you say, "Hey, where's the real king of Saudi Arabia?" Can you imagine the insult? Can you imagine this king now who has carried on the family dynasty of ruling? Like, can you imagine how insulting it is to call someone else the real king of Saudi Arabia, right? That's the shock and the punch as the Magi show up to the royal court asking Herod this question. And they continue, they say, "We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed. And that word there is he was stirred, he was terrified. Imagine quiet waters that begin to rumble and ripple because of the storm that visits it. And in that same way, he begins to get disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. As I mentioned, as we're going through this passage, we're going to highlight a couple of different reactions to how people respond to Jesus. The first reaction we see is the paranoia or the fear of Herod, the paranoia or fear of Herod. Here's a little bit of background to Herod the Great. Why was he called Herod the Great? He was called Herod the Great because he thought he was pretty great. Now, he was, it's good, and it's great. So, too many puns, my mind's like, all these tabs are opening up, but during the era that he's reigning, Rome is in power. And when Rome is in power, Herod too hedges his horse onto, or his what? His carriage, right? Is that the saying? Carriage onto the Roman horse, if you will. And he too rises in power during this time. He's called Herod the Great because of his building projects. He loved to build things, and he had vision architecturally to build things. As a matter of fact, if you were to go to Israel today, you'll see many of the aqueducts that he has built from then that have survived 20 plus centuries, right? And so there are many different Herods that we see in Scripture, but this Herod is Herod the Great. He's the dad. And then you see the Herod Antipas and other characters like that. He, on one side, would kiss kiss the ring of Rome on one hand, and he was a tyrant to his people. So he had this two-faced kind of relationship where to the Romans he would curry favor, and with his people he would look down at them. He would be this brutal tyrant. He had 10 wives, which I imagine is just a lot. It's a busy household, right? I can't imagine Christmas. And as a matter of fact, that's how we get into the Christmas story, right? Because of Herod. And they had many kids. They all competed for the throne, so it's very contentious. As he became older, he began to get paranoid. He was actually very, very paranoid, especially in his later years. He had a number of family members that were executed and imprisoned. His favorite wife, Miriam, what would you do to your favorite wife? What would you do, huh? Had her executed along with her two sons, Alexander and Aristobulus is his name. One more thing about this. When he planned out his funeral, which is its own fascinating kind of thing, he had it in such a way where I think it was all the royal people in Jerusalem would get killed at the same time that he dies, so that there would be such mourning in the city of things that they're all crying for Herod. Yeah. So imagine being the guy receiving those instructions. Hey, here's how I'd like to die and be commemorated, kill everybody, but that's how paranoid he was when he thought about this. Caesar would rather be Herod's pig than his own son, because his pig has enjoyed longevity of life in ways that his sons haven't. Mark Twain says that to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And Herod was a man with a hammer. He looked to nail down everybody and everything in sight that would threaten his own power. Two more things about Herod the Great. He was not Jewish, but Idumean, south of Judea. When he goes to Rome, they give him a title in the Roman Senate. You know what the title is? King of the Jews. So he's this non-Jewish Jewish king of the Jews. And he was power insecure and a power-hungry tyrant, and he's given the title King of the Jews. And here in this passage, the Magi come knocking on the door and says, we'd like to see the real King of the Jews. Can you imagine the paranoia? No wonder Matthew uses that word of disturbance, right? Like quiet waters that begin to rumble and ripple with the storm that visits it. You see the fear of Herod, the terror, he's terrified, he's stirred up. There's a storm brewing up inside of Herod. Can you imagine being in that room while that interaction went down? Can you imagine the diplomatic situation that he has to now navigate as these international royal court people, we'll get to the Magi in a second, they show up to his house and show up to his royal court and ask him about, he's got to keep his best face on. He's insulted because he's the title of the Roman, he's the king of the Jews. And he probably even sees the gifts that they bring for the king of the Jews that remained unopened while they're visiting him, right? And what does he do? Verse 4, when he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. He has a little Bible study to figure out, hey, what do the scriptures say about this king of the Jews character? In Bethlehem in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. This is Micah 5:2 and 2 Samuel 5:2 that gets stitched together, right? The prophetic voice that talks about this. So the first, we see the paranoia, we see the fear of Herod, and the second reaction we see is the indifference of the religious leaders, Herod goes to the religious leaders and has this little Bible study to figure out, hey, what do the scriptures say about this king of the Jews character? The religious leaders, they miss out on two things. They miss out on the star that had been in the sky, and they miss out on the prophetic word that they had access to during that time. God never showed up on the radar for them. And what a tragedy it is that religious leaders during that time, one supposedly that were meant to be ambassadors of God, have no clue that God has just shown up on the doors of human history. The religious culture of that time was one of indifference. It was a lack of interest and apathy and inertia. Think about Zechariah, who had been praying for a long time for a child, and Zechariah, his name in Hebrew means the Lord remembers. Zechariah is to remember. And here he is when the Lord says, hey, I've answered your prayer, I'm going to give you a child, and he's like, what are you talking about? What are we talking about here? And he's like, remember, you prayed for a child and has to remember him. So he goes mute and that whole story, but you kind of get a sense of the spiritual inertia during this time. There's no expectation for God to hear the prayers of the people, and there's no expectation for God to show up in the everyday lives of people. If indifference was a vibe, it would sound like, It looks like shrugging. It sounds like whatever. I don't care. Whatever you want to do, yeah. Sure, it's resignation. It's a sense of I've given up. It's a sense of passivity. They were under Roman occupation. They had no spiritual leadership from Herod, the non-Jewish Jewish king. They were awaiting the Messiah, but it felt like a pipe dream. And from the day-to-day life of the people, they just had this strong sense of indifference towards this, right? An apathy and inertia to life and faith. You know, I would contend this morning that we're actually not that far away from the indifference of the religious leaders. We live in a modern world that looks to wane down our passion for God, to chisel off the edge that we have for faith, and descend into our own apathy, descend into our own spiritual inertia. Eric Jacobson, he's written a book called 3 Pieces of Glass, Why We Feel Lonely in a World Mediated by Screens. He talks about these 3 pieces of glass. And I want to say this, you know, Jacobson's work's really about loneliness and how, again, screens mediate loneliness in our world. But I do think there's a connection, there's a live link to indifference, too, in our world. He talks about the 3 pieces of glass, the smartphone screen, the TV screen, and the windshield. The smartphone screen, the TV shield, and the windshield. Let's go through each of these. The smartphone screen. Do you know how many times the average iPhone user touches their iPhone in one day? I'm sorry? Yeah, 2,617 times a day. That is on average. Power users, heavy users, aka teens, touch their phones over 5,427 times a day. That adds up, on average, 1 million for average users and about 2 million touches per year. How we feeling this morning? When participants were given the same information we just looked at, do you know what their reaction was? 5 seconds of shock, and they ended with a wholehearted meh, indifference, right? And an inattentiveness that it has. Our phones distract us from connection and relationship, and the time and attention it takes to foster love and relationships, right? Microsoft researcher Linda Stone said that we live in we have continuous partial attention, and that is our new normal, continuous partial attention. The era of parenting where Diane and I are in, we have 5 and 2-year-olds, and so whenever we drive on the road, sometimes we count out loud how many seconds of uninterrupted time we get as adult parents. And so sometimes we'll count, we got 30 seconds, and it's like, da-da-da-da-da-da, you know, and then it's like, all right, we got a minute, and it's like, hey, break up a fight, you know, or resupply snacks and things like that. But that's true of all of us who have smartphones. The notifications we get, the way we're fidgety and we're in social settings, and where's my phone, and all the touches, right, that add up to, and the ways that it gets in the way of us being attentive to one another. Phone screen, second one, TV screen. The average American, guess how many hours per day the average American spends watching television? When I mean average, I'm in that average, right? All of us. 3 to 4 hours a day of television. 3 to 4 hours a day of television. Netflix, I think it was this week or last week, just released its first ever report on viewership numbers. It's fascinating and terrifying. Between January and June of this year, guess how many hours Netflix subscribers watched Netflix content? Just Netflix content this year, January through June. Any numbers? Huh? 1 billion, yeah. Times 100 billion hours. You were close, David. 100 billion hours of Netflix content watched between the first 6 hours. And there's a part of it that's shocked, but how many of us are really shocked? How many of us, we watch an episode of whatever, and then those last 3 seconds when the credits roll up and it's like you see the circle turning and you've got 3 seconds to fight, your willpower has no shot against a building storyline, and they've just left you on a cliffhanger, and of course you've got to watch the next episode, which rinses and repeats, and it's 2:30 a.m. and you're like, I've got work the next day, and I'm finally exhausted. No, I should actually go to sleep at this point. Like, how many of us, right? TV screens. Anybody get sucked in, right? One more episode. Third, the windshield. The average commute time of somebody in Westchester County. Any guesses on how average commute time? One way. 35 minutes is what it says, but for some of you, you're like, I will gladly take. How many of you are like, I'll take 35 minutes any day? For many of us, right, who drive and you take the Metro North, it's a different kind of windshield that we look out of, but it travels anywhere from 3 to 2 hours, right, of commuting just one way. Many of you have to catch buses and trains and switch from the Metro North and get to Grand Central and take the shuttle and then head further downtown or uptown, and it adds up, the time that we spent commuting. This was a 24-hour breakdown of most of our life with the framework of screens, right? These 3 screens and how much time they add up here. I want to say a pastoral note here, which is that I don't say this to say this pejoratively. I have screens. As a matter of fact, I'm preaching out of my iPad, and so I've got screens as I'm talking about screens, right? There are so many sacrifices that we have to make, and I just want to acknowledge that we make to make it through one day of work, right? And so you've got many different decisions you need to make, many different things you need to clarify. So I don't mean that kind of pejoratively, but I really say that less of what are you doing and more of who are you becoming. It's a soul question. It's a formation question. Who are you becoming as your life is mediated by screens? In what ways is indifference seeping into your life and eventually overtaking the very spirit of your life? Who are you becoming with the distraction, the escapism, and the commuting? Is all this fermenting in a slow stew of indifference and apathy? Is there a slow buildup where you too can identify with the religious leaders and you too say, whatever, I'm too tired? Sure. And you too descend into passivity, right? It grinds out our passion for God into this passivity. And this attentiveness for God is exchanged by distraction and a sense of inattentiveness. These religious leaders, they get stuck in the monotony of everyday life, and their indifference causes them to miss out on God breaking into human history. And for those of us where I'm including myself in that, we're shaped by the exact same waters and the exact same screens, in what ways does that cause us to be inattentive to God? If God wants to speak in your life and break through in your life through the monotony, do we have him on our radar? Are there ways in which we would be aware and attentive to God speaking, God calling, God leading, God convicting, God correcting, God loving, God edifying us in our own lives? So what happens next? Verse 7. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me that I too may go and worship him." And after they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, remember, this is no longer a manger, Jesus there in a house, and saw the child. This word, he's not an infant anymore. He's probably 18 to 24 months, most likely. Jesus is a toddler by this time. With his mother Mary, they bowed down and they worshiped him. Then they opened up their treasures, right? They were closed after months of travel, and presented him with gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. We see the fear, the paranoia of Herod. We see the indifference of the religious leaders. And finally, we see the joy of the Magi. The joy of the Magi. Different reaction. Who were the Magi? Who were the Magi? This word Magi, Magos, is connected to, Magos probably, and is related to the word magician. Now, it's less like birthday clown and, hey, here's a deck of cards, like pick something, right? Like this kind of street magic kind of tricks. Different connotation for the word magic than we would understand it today. They were cabinet members. They were royal court figures in probably the Persian or the Babylonian court. They were royal advisors to the king. They would be skilled in things like astrology and politics, the sciences and religious life. They were top of their graduating class, if you will, right? So these were, think Daniel, but centuries later, right? And so they're top of their class. People depict them as 3 because of the 3 gifts, but likely it was a larger traveling party. I'll get to that in a second. They were significant Jewish centers of learning in Babylon at the time of the Magi, right? Daniel kind of onward. So they were probably regularly exposed to Hebrew scriptures, prophecy, and teachers from the Jewish diaspora that lived in Babylon. Let's map out their journey for a second. So the Magi, they're skilled in astrology and things like that, so they see the star, and after they see the star, they keep looking at the star. They're trying to make sense of the star. They can't, so they probably access their own literature on trying to make sense of what the star is, what does it represent. They check out Hebrew prophecy during that point. They connect the dots, and they figure out this is the star of the King of the Jews, right? Herod doesn't introduce this title to them. They introduce this title to Herod, King of the Jews, and they map out their journey, which is about 900 miles from Babylon to Jerusalem. 900 miles, which means that likely, and then they begin to put together arrangements for travel and gather a traveling party. So this would have been months on end for them to get to, and that's why it wasn't, the night that Jesus was born, but probably in the 18 to 24 months. When you're traveling that long by foot, you don't just show up with 3 people into the desert. You need a traveling party. You need cooks and medics and supplies that would, just sustain you for months of travel there, 900 miles, and months of travel back. So they would have been gone for about a year and a half. Can you imagine telling your employer that? Hey, I'm going to be gone for the next year and a half because I've seen this star. And we just got to get to the end of it. It's the King of the Jews, and that's what they did, right? They probably got permission from the royal court to go on this, and then they even thought about what are gifts? Think about the thought process they go to. What are gifts that are appropriate for the King of the Jews? What do we give him? And thinks about the gold and the frankincense and myrrh. And then they get to the royal court, they meet Herod, and they find out they trick him because Herod asks him, hey, when did you see the star last? He's trying to connect the dots. And then they finally see the star again. They're filled with joy. They enter the house, and they meet Jesus in this home. A couple things about this that I want to highlight. Do you see the earnestness of the Magi? The earnestness of the Magi. There's no distraction or escapism, but we see this attentive life to the possibility. They did not have concrete confirmations about any of this, but they go with a sense of possibility of this could be the King of the Jews. And we want to explore this possibility. Herod looks down at people, the religious leaders, they look sideways and elsewhere, but the Magi look up, and they're attentive to the ways that God can break out on the radar of their own life. Do you see the courage of the Magi? They risk their own lives by defying Herod. Right? It's insulting to Herod. And they also risk international hostility by leaving Herod hanging. And they leave another way, even though Herod had worked out this little situation, this little contract with them, right? Do you see the humility of the Magi? You see, in power in the ancient world, dynamically, is not that different than power in the modern world, where you would only pay homage to people more powerful than you. And for them to bring gifts that befit a king and show up to Herod with all of these gifts closed. Think about that, right? If you're in the room with Herod, you see the gifts closed, and they're not opening up for the King of the Jews, but they continue to hold on to them till they finally come and meet Jesus. And they don't give gifts to the tyrant, but instead to the toddler, right? And think about the humility that it takes. This is a powerful picture by Gentile da Fabriano, the Italian 14th, 15th century painter called The Adoration of the Magi. And it's a really powerful picture because you see kind of a sense of it's no longer 3 Magi, but you see kind of all that they come with. There's so much going on in this picture right here. But do you see the traveling party, the attention, the busyness on the picture of the right, and the horses, and they're somehow scrambling or they're just squished together on the right side of this picture, but there's openness to the left side of the picture, right? Beautiful, beautiful painting. And here you see the Magi, the 3 that's depicted here, right? And what does this one do? They're on all fours. One of the Magi, he's bald, he's gray-bearded, he's someone of age, he's kind of wise and has some gravitas to him, if you will. And what does he do? He gets on all 4 and he kisses the feet of Jesus. What a powerful picture. Can you imagine being in that room while that was happening? Can you imagine while you were at the door, while the Magi show up to the front doors, and all of a sudden there's veneration and honor and hospitality for the Magi as they come in. And as they come and said, we've come for the King of the Jews. And many of them may be like, what are you talking about? We just have Joseph, Mary, and this toddler Jesus. And they come and they bring the gifts and they get on all fours and they come with all this commotion. But here in the house, there's a quietness and this beautiful moment where months and months and months of searching and longing come crashing down into this one moment where he gets on all fours and he kisses the feet of Jesus in adoration. Can you imagine that moment? Ephraim the Syrian, the greatest poet in church history, talks about that moment. He says, the Magi brought myrrh and gold, while in him was hidden a treasure of riches. The myrrh and spices which he had prepared and created did the Magi bring him of his own. It was by power and from him that Mary was able to bear in her bosom him that bears up all things. Peter Chrysologist, the 4th century Italian bishop, reflects on that moment. He says, today the Magi find crying in a manger the one they have followed as he shone in the sky. Today the Magi see clearly in swaddling clothes the one they long awaited as he lay hidden among the stars. Today the Magi gaze in deep wonder at what they see, heaven on earth, earth in heaven, man in God, God in man, one whom the whole universe cannot contain, now enclosed in a tiny body. Can you imagine the power of that moment? One whom the whole universe cannot contain, now enclosed in a tiny body. Do you see the heart of God here? Can we go back to that picture? This picture was God's intended vision for when the star appeared on the sky. This was what God was betting on. Can we go back to that picture of the painting of the adoration of the Magi? This picture right here is what the heart of God was rooting the Magi towards all along. People who were far away from God now coming into the fold. People who were geographically and relationally and theologically far away from God now coming into this moment of not just encountering the living God, but worshiping him. You see, what a beautiful picture of discipleship this picture is right here. When we lift up our hands and worship and we give the best that we can give God, that is what the heart of God has been rooting for all along, basking in the love of God, giving us the privilege that we get to worship and come and adore Jesus who has entered human history. Revealing himself progressively till they made Jesus in the flesh, right? Showing up signs all along till they come and culminate in this moment. Friends, we've seen 3 reactions to Jesus in this passage: the fear and paranoia of Herod, the indifference of the religious leaders, and the joy of the Magi. And as we get ready to sing, I want to ask you, where do you see yourself in this passage? Which characters, perhaps, can you most resonate with? Because Jesus is the same, right? He's King Jesus. But how do you react to King Jesus this morning? Is Jesus a threat to the life that you want to live? Does he get in the way of how you see life and how you spend your time, talent, and your treasure? Are you indifferent to Jesus where you say, I don't really care? Whatever. And has that spirit of indifference seeped into and spoiled the larger flow of your life? Indifference. Or perhaps is it joy where you've seen Jesus and you've had this moment where you say, I can enter into the joy that he has given me. You're responding to the stars that God has providentially put in your life. And as you experience the pursuing love of God, that you say, God, I want to enter into your joy. You just enter into the joy that God has given you. Each of them, they get the Jesus that they react to, but only the Magi get the joy of God. So as the worship team is coming up, and we're going to get ready to sing this song, Rejoice. Rejoice, O come, Emmanuel. It's a song that's evocative, inviting you into the larger God drama in history. So would we sing this song together and enter into the joy that God has for us?